across the country, including the delta town of Bến Tre. Now prospering, Bến Tre was the scene of some of the heaviest fighting during Tet. There was so much damage that an American major made the memorable comment to this reporter, "We had to destroy the town in order to save it." Vietnamese from both the north and the south were swept up into the war. This soldier lost his leg in an ambush near Bến Tre, and after 26 years is being fitted with a new one.
I had no choice. I was forced to join one side or the other, and it was the Saigon forces that got me.
President Richard Nixon began pulling American troops out of Vietnam in 1969, and most were happy to be going home. But the war would not be forgotten. One former Marine comparing it to the trauma of a car accident.
Well, one tour of duty in Vietnam was 8,700 hours in a row of being in a car accident every single day.
The American withdrawal had a direct effect on Tay Ninh province northwest of Saigon, home of the colorful Cao Dai religious sect. Though troops were leaving, dramatically increased U.S. bombing in the area sapped the morale of the communist troops.
Some of our force surrendered to the enemy. They did not understand the objective. They did not believe enough to win.
But the bombing was not enough to save the South Vietnamese army, which by 1973 was left to fight the communists alone. On April 30, 1975, communist tanks rolled into Saigon after a blistering final offensive, and the war was over.
We did not have as modern or sophisticated weapons as the Americans, but we had our patriotism and our love towards our country.
The victorious Vietnamese commander sees total commitment as the primary factor.
A small country like ours, to defend itself, has to mobilize its whole people and all of its resources, and to fight for the long term. It was clear that the American leadership was not willing to fight for the long term and lacked the support of its own people.
Well, that's what the Vietnamese military officers do tell us. Dedication to the cause, support of the people, something they claim that America lacked, Bernie.
Peter, the communist side lost at least 1 million men. How do they justify that to the people?
Interestingly enough, Bernie, there has been some, excuse me, questions raised by writers here in Vietnam in the last couple of years about that sacrifice. Was it really worth it now that you have a free market flourishing in this country? The military leadership we talk to say it was a terrible price. There's cemeteries all over this country, but they say that's what it took to win the war, to oust foreigners and to unite the country. Terrible price, but what they say that it's worthwhile, Bernie.
Some American military people feel the war was winnable. How does that seem to you?
If the U.S. had moved into Laos, Cambodia, doubled its commitment, maybe it would have blunted the North Vietnamese, Bernie, but I think the U.S. would still be here trying to keep a very uneasy peace.
Thank you, Peter Arnett in Ho Chi Minh City. When we come back, we'll get perspectives from General Vo Nguyen Giap in Ho Chi Minh City and from General William Westmoreland at his home in South Carolina. Have they found peace after the war? It is the burden of command. Those issuing orders in wartime know someone is going to die. That burden cannot be blotted out in peacetime. But the knowledge that those who died did not do so in vain may make it easier to bear. General William Childs Westmoreland commanded U.S. forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 68. He also served as Army Chief of Staff, and he retired from the military in 1972. General Westmoreland joins us from Charleston, South Carolina. General, thanks for joining us. And I must ask you, have you found peace after the war?
Well, I think most of us who were involved feel that we gave it our best efforts. And it was not the military that lost the war. The war was lost by the Case-Church Amendment to the fiscal, I think it was a 78 Appropriation Act. That was our final action, which was an action of Congress. Presumably, the members of Congress thought that they were carrying out the wishes of the electorate. But that's when the war was lost. It was not lost on the battlefield.
Do you think that you were handcuffed by civilian leaders in Washington?
The war was tightly controlled by the Pentagon and with the president very much involved. There was great concern that the Chinese and the Russians would be brought to the battlefield. In other words, the two major communist powers. For that reason, there was considerable control over our actions at the Washington level. The control that was most difficult for me to cope with was that we were not allowed to go into Laos and cut the enemy's logistical pipeline through Laos. Laos was an independent country. The North Vietnamese took advantage of that totally, and we were never able to cut that trail because the political authorities looked at Laos as an independent country. The policy was enunciated that we would not geographically expand the war. And that was the most vexing experience that I had, was the inability to cut the pipeline through the little country of Laos.
I'm curious, did you ever tell President Johnson, people in the Pentagon, look, if you keep this up, if you don't let us go into Laos, we're not going to win this war?
Well, I saw President Johnson on a number of occasions, and certainly I don't remember exactly when or how I expressed myself, but he certainly knew my feeling on this matter. He certainly was aware of the inhibiting nature of that restriction. On the other hand, he was advised during those days by Ambassador Averell Harriman, who felt very, very strongly that the war should not be enlarged and moved into Laos. And that was a matter that we had to live with. But it was a vexing problem for those of us trying to win on the battlefield. And we did win on every battlefield, but we did not cut the enemy's pipeline for the reasons that I've enumerated.
Well, given all these restrictions on you, how many times did you curse and how many times did you punch the wall in where you lived? You must have been totally frustrated.
Well, the military, of course, is totally subservient to the political authority, and certainly the political authority understood the situation. But those of us who held military responsibilities, we assumed that at an appropriate time there would be a conference and some accommodation would be made. In view of the fact that we could not invade North Vietnam, we had to hurt the enemy and strengthen our friends, i.e. the South Vietnamese, to the point that we would become progressively superfluous, in which context we had assumed that there would be some sort of an arrangement made through diplomatic means.
If I hear you correctly, am I accurate in assuming that you feel that American civilians lost the Vietnam War and not American fighting women and men?
Well, the soldiers, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardmen that fought that war were magnificent. They did not lose a battle of consequence. They may have lost a few skirmishes, but the loss was relatively small compared with the losses that we had suffered in other wars. So there's no question at all that our American fighting man in Vietnam did a magnificent job. And indeed, it was not he who lost the war.
In terms of fighting and professional soldiering, what is the difference, or what was the difference, between South Vietnam's army and North Vietnam's army?
Well, Of course, ethnically, they were both Vietnamese. The Vietnamese in the South were defending their territory, and they normally put up a very good fight. The Vietnamese in the North were crusaders. They were highly indoctrinated under the communist system. They were well supplied by Russia and China. And that brings to mind another matter that hovered over the policymakers. The policymakers in Washington did not want to broaden the war. They did not want to encourage China and Russia to get involved in that conflict.
In terms of Americans who say United States participation in the war was a terrible, terrible mistake, former Defense Secretary McNamara has just said that in his book. What do you say to them?
Well, a military man is totally subservient to civilian authority. Those of us who were on the battlefield, and I think I speak for the vast majority, we felt that we were fighting for principle, a principle of self-determination. We were fighting against an enemy who was aggressive, who was trying to take over the South and impose their communist system over the population of the South. We were motivated by those considerations. At least I was, and I think many of my troops likewise.
And finally, General Westmoreland, if you could, what would you say to General Giap?
Well, General Giap was an accomplished military commander without any question. He was a commander that fought many wars. He and I were not counterparts. Giap held a political office as well as a military position. I was a field commander that reported to the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, who in turn reported to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. Giap, without any question, was a very talented commander and a very fine tactician, which the French discovered and which we also are aware of by virtue of our conflict on the battlefield in Southeast Asia.
General Westmoreland, we thank you very much for joining us on this anniversary.
My pleasure.
General Vo Nguyen Giap was the organizer and chief strategist for the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam during the war. He joins us now from Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you for joining us on this special report, General. Can you tell us, please, what strategy did you use to advance all the way to Saigon?
The whole world acknowledged the 2nd September 1945 in the Independence Declaration, which declared the coming into being of Ho Chi Minh, of President of Vietnam. Our President Ho Chi Minh acknowledged all the great thoughts of the French revolutions, but only 3 weeks after, the French sent troops to Vietnam, and then the bloodiest war took place in our history, which lasted for more than 30 years.